Okay, hi everyone. It's noon, so we're going to kick off. I know that we will have a minute or two where participants are joining from the waiting room, so I'll speak a little bit slowly and introduce myself and the series and take my time doing that while our numbers tick up here. I'm so pleased that everybody could join us today. I've really been looking forward to this session for weeks now. Um, I'm Andrea Durkin. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm the current president of Women in International Trade, the DC chapter. And I think a lot of you have heard me say this before, but during my tenure, this is a weird year, obviously, and it's become really important to me that as we deliver content-based programming on trade issues, the usual stuff, what I really wanted to focus on this year especially is delivering a series of programming that are professional development focused, skills focused, so that we can all support each other this year and really make sure that we're all able to grow in this very strange year. Everybody's experiencing something different in their careers and their jobs. And one thing that I think it's so special that we can do to support each other is to deliver this kind of programming that helps us invest in ourselves at a time like this. So I'm really excited. This is one of those programs. We started the program professional development series in September, and we did a few executive ready programs. So we had Darcy Vetter and we had Susan Schwab on to talk about how to serve on a corporate board. How do you ready yourself? How do you get recruited and that sort of thing? We had Tracy Gopal, who's a financial expert in San Francisco, talk to us about all the different boxes that you need to check to serve on a board. And many of us would get recruited for our international expertise, but we may lack in financial awareness and understanding of how corporations how to read a balance sheet, P&L, and that sort of thing. And so Tracy talked to us about how we top up those kind of skills. And then we heard from Claire Chino, who is really special. She is the head of Itochu North America. So she talked about how she manages as a woman in the C-suite. And so this is an extension of that series. And I'm really pleased that Sonni, you could be here with us today. Sonni's background is really fascinating to me. It's incredibly impressive. Sonni is a former foreign correspondent in Moscow and Tokyo for the LA Times. She is also a former State Department correspondent in DC. She's been an editorial writer, an op-ed writer, a speech writer at the State Department, and really an expert in helping others learn how to communicate effectively. And Sonni and I met, we've gotten to know each other this year. I'm really happy for that opportunity because you've been putting on a series for journalists to help them get ready to cover trade essentially. So you've done a really incredible series that I know is on your website, the past videos, and then you're getting ready to do another series in January for trade journalists. And I've learned so much from you, Sonni, just in our casual interactions. I have to say that I've always been very intimidated to speak to journalists, to work with journalists, a little bit fearful, about how I might come across or get quoted or that sort of thing. And so I was really anxious to put on this program with you so that the rest of the WIT members, to the extent they feel the same way, could learn from you about how to engage journalists. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonni to speak for about 15 minutes. We have plenty of time for Q&A, and I want to encourage people to put your questions in the chat if you prefer to just type them and I can deliver them to Sonni, or you can use the raise hand feature and we'll bring you on to the platform so that you can ask Sonni your question directly. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Sonni. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so happy to speak to you today. For most of my career, I was desperate to find wonderful women's sources so that I could quote them more, and it wasn't easy, and it's getting easier, and I'm really happy about that. But now, as president of the National Press Foundation, we are, as Andrea mentioned, running a series of trainings for journalists on international trade, and so I'm both trying to prepare speakers to do a good job speaking to the journalists and briefing the journalists and basically speaking reporter at the same time as we're trying to prepare the journalists to ask smarter questions and kind of get the nuance of what they're being told. So, you know, I'm playing both ends. So I will start.
Right, and Sonni, I'm sorry, I should have said your current title.
Oh,
I forgot to say that. So maybe you could explain.
Oh, sure.
Anybody doesn't know what the National Press Foundation is and does.
Sure. So I'm president of the National Press Foundation. It's a small NGO in Washington. We have two missions. We train journalists to basically, our motto is we make good journalists better. So we train journalists on the current issues of the day, and we help them to understand the depth and nuance and complexity. We also train them on digital tools that they need to do their jobs. And the second thing we do is give awards. If you go to our website, which I hope you will do after this, www.nationalpress.org, and you'll see we've got some wonderful award winners. We just yesterday we're doing an award for George Will, but we also have a trade award that we're going to announce actually probably next week. It's called the Heinrich Foundation Award, and I think many of you will have read the stories, and if you haven't, please do, because they're fabulous. So that's sort of what we are, who we are, and what we do. And Andrea, of course, has stood out as somebody who really cares about, you know, communicating, and is an unusually good translator of complex trade issues into English and into reporter speak. So she's just been invaluable, and we've had a great time getting to know her. So I just want to say one word about this talk. Actually, this is talk that I started writing in the State Department for diplomats. I was asked to, as a speechwriter, I was asked to speak to diplomats who were trying at that time to get the Secretary of State to give remarks on their issue, whatever it was. And there's a big competition, as you know, within the government to get the Secretary to focus on your issue and talk about your issue. And I would get these briefing papers saying the Secretary should come here and give a speech on this. And I'd read them and I'd go, you must be kidding. Like, why would the Secretary go do this? And if she did, why would she want to give a speech on that? And that's sort of not what she would say. And so I was asked to kind of talk about how to think about communications and how to think about what makes a good communication. And this talk stems from that. But I'm also going to give you some just practical advice that I've learned over the years. It's the same advice I give, and you'll hear this. I give it to CEOs, I give it to children, I give it to journalists. You know, it's the same principles apply. I've learned a lot myself this year because I've had to go on Zoom, and everything that I used to do in person now we're doing on Zoom. So it's that much harder, but the same principles really apply. So when you're talking to journalists, it's basically the same as communicating with anybody else. Could I have the first slide, please? Is it up? Because I'm not seeing it on my screen.
Yes,
oh, here it is. Oh, it is up. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much. Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, so I call this talk How to Be Heard because it's not easy to be heard. And it's also not easy to get through past the journalists to your audience, and so to be quoted. So among the many intimidating questions that Andrea mentioned, and things that are generally, you know, difficult is, you know, how do you get quoted? People are always asking me, what do you have to do to get quoted? So you want to get quoted, you want to get your message across. You're probably understandably worried about being misquoted or having your remarks taken out of context. You're worried that the reporter, you know, probably isn't understanding the technicals of and the nuances of what you're saying, and that's probably true. They probably aren't. And also, you know, every person who's ever talked to a journalist is deeply anxious about coming off badly, including me when I'm speaking, knowing that I'm going to be quoted. So I believe in bottom line up front. So I'm going to give you the secret sauce right now. Could I have the next slide, please? It's not very secret. Okay, well, here is my, you know, my secret advice. So first of all, you should never lie to a reporter. And when I say lie, I am not talking about a very narrow presidential lie that can be proved and fact checked. I'm saying, I'm using that term in a very broad sense. There's lots of things that you can say. I can't talk to you. I can't tell you that. I might be able to talk about that next week. I really can't discuss that. I can't tell you this, but I can tell you that. The one thing you must never, ever, ever do is lie. And when I worked at the State Department, I was absolutely astounded by the number of people that came to me and said, can't we just tell them this? And I would say, no, you're nuts. Like, this is the worst thing. Don't call them back, say no, don't talk to them, but never, ever lie. And I will just tell you candidly that inside newsrooms, there is a code of payback. Lots of things are forgiven. Sources who are wrong are forgiven. Sources who don't tell you stuff are forgiven. People who give better stories to your competitors and then they give you a story that's not quite as good as what they gave the New York Times, they're forgiven. If people lie to your face, we punish them. That is sort of in the secret reporter code, is punish sources who lie. And you see it all over the place. You see it with the Trump officials. You saw it with the Obama administration officials. I submit you will see it with Biden officials. Just never, ever do it. The second thing is you got to be quotable. And how do you be quotable? That's my whole talk really is about how to do that. It's easy to say it. It's really hard to do it. But I'm going to try to tell you how. The advice is you got to distill your message. You got to practice your message. It's like anything else. No one is born knowing how to do this. And then you got to distill your message some more. And I will talk about specifically like how to do that. And the third piece of advice I have is you must do the work for them. Reporters are busy. They're exhausted. Everyone's exhausted. Listeners are exhausted. Readers are exhausted. The advice that I got when I became a reporter back in the Pleasite era was that you must write for someone with an 8th grade education. The Associated Press, where I trained, enforced that. I'm actually thinking that that may be too generous now because people are so busy, so distracted, and it's so hard. So you have to do all the work. Do not assume that the reporter will do the work of translating it. You must do it for them. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about how to implement this seemingly simple advice. And it's easier to show you what not to do than to tell you what to do. So let's talk about what not to do. This is a PowerPoint that was created by the inimitable Peter Norvig, who was director of research at Google. And I bet he sat through a lot of really horrible PowerPoint presentations, and he created this one. Could I have the next slide, please? Keep going. Yep, keep going. I'm sure you all know the Gettysburg Address, that Peter Norvik's patter that when he's watching this is he's saying, good morning, just a second while I get this connection to work. Do I press this button here? Function F7, oh, no, that's not right. Well, maybe I'll have to reboot. Well, hold on a minute. My name is Abe Lincoln and I'm your president. And while we're waiting, I just want to thank Judge David Wills. He's chairman of the committee supervising the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery. It's great to be here, Dave. And you and the committee are doing a great job. Well, PowerPoint does have glitches, but I guess we couldn't live without it, could we? Well, okay, now we're ready to go. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. Can you have the next slide, please? I'd like to point out while you're watching this, that this is entirely 100% accurate. Keep going, please. So this is a, oh, can you go back? So this is a fair and truthful and accurate summary of what is in the Gettysburg Address. And the fact that it's truly horrible is interesting because this passes in Washington, not just in the Pentagon, but in a lot of other agencies where we have death by PowerPoint. This passes for acceptable. And I want to just start by saying, this is horrible, never do it. It is awful. And there's a reason why, the Gettysburg Address is what it is. You can ruin everything. Go back to the original. Think through your message. Be short, be eloquent. And, and let's just talk about what we really want to say, first of all. Okay, so could I have the next slide? The second thing I want to talk about this because this is what is happening in the brain of the person you are talking to. You're seeing a nice, put together, well-coiffed journalist. Maybe they're on Zoom, or maybe they're on print, or maybe, you see them in person, you see them on the phone. And you think that, and the person that you're talking to, this is what's going on in their brain. And actually the viewer or the reader or the listener of the podcast, this is also what's going through their brain. So when you plan your communication with journalists, you just try to remember, try to keep this vision of this cat in your head and think about how you're going to try to get that cat's attention. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so whenever I talk about the Gettysburg Address, everyone says, yes, but that was Lincoln. And, you know, why are you talking about Lincoln? That's just a ridiculous standard. And what I'd like to say is that it isn't. Eloquence is an aspiration, but concision is a strategy. And unless you're concise, you will not be quoted. And your first job here is to be quoted. Before anything, you got to get through that hurdle. If you are not quotable, then every other piece you will ever get from very fancy people with, you know, big titles and lots of experience, all of that advice will be useless to you because you won't get quoted. So please aspire to be eloquent. It doesn't come naturally to anybody, but work very hard at being concise, because that comes to everybody with work. The most quotable people are both eloquent and clever. I am not one of them. The rest of us have to settle for being concise. So work at that. It's a strategy. But concision specifically, it improves your quotability. It reduces the chances that you'll be misquoted. And it increases the likelihood that your quote won't get cut. I've seen a lot of wonderful quotes get cut. And in fact, I had a wonderful story once, ran on page 1, went through 5 editors, very sensitive story, had the best quote ever. Each editor that edited me moved the quote up 1 paragraph until it was in the 2nd paragraph. And then the page 1 editor cut it because it was in the 2nd paragraph and the quote was gone. On the cutting room floor, I cried. This happens in newsrooms. It happens everywhere, and you don't want to be cut. And to do that, your soundbite has to be really short. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But first, I want to talk about how to think about concision. So the writer, William Zinsser, said that fighting clutter is like fighting weeds. The writer is always slightly behind, and new varieties sprout overnight. So when you open a Microsoft Word document, first think about the cat. And I hope you will write down what you're going to say to the reporter. First, think about the cat, and then think about your reader, and just go through that document and just whack. So you want to think about this. If you're a fan of Marie Kondo of fighting clutter, you know, removing clutter sparks joy. So anyway, go through and just remove all the excess words. The second thing, and this is hard to do, but it's something about how to think as opposed to what to do, but you have to stop thinking in paragraphs. I looked at the very distinguished list of people who are joining us today, and you guys are awesome, and you're all fabulously educated, and you've got wonderful careers, and you probably think in multiple paragraphs, but listeners don't. And in a speech or in when you're reading something casually, you're reading the newspaper while somebody's preparing coffee, while your kids are doing their homework, while something else is going on. Really, the reader cognitively is only able to focus on 1 sentence at a time. And every sentence matters, but the most important sentence is the first one. And my first editor taught me that the reader always has a choice. They can stop reading, they can stop listening, they can zone out. So if they decide to stay with you for the next sentence, then that next sentence has to be good. So I urge you to think by sentence, not by paragraph. And again, it's easier said than done, but it can be done. Next slide, please. So with the cat, and I think this slide, I made this slide before the pandemic, and I think it's even more true now, that people are cognitively exhausted. And cognitive exhaustion makes people lazy. This is something from the neuroscience, and I use this word lazy. It's a loaded word, but I'm using it as the term of art because it's to help you remember that you need to do the work for your audience, that you cannot make them do mental work because they're not capable of it anymore. And when the human brain gets overloaded, it shuts down. Now, game designers are the people who understand this best of all right now, not speechwriters or Abraham Lincoln. Game designers literally do studies on their game. They work very hard to figure out how much you challenge the player and they like it. And when you overload them too much, they shut down and then they sign off, they give up. So game designers spend all their time trying to find that sweet spot, and we can too. So cognitive overload is not just an issue because people aren't listening to you. It also inhibits uptake. It physically disrupts the formation of long-term memory. And that's why people who've studied this, there's this theory in neuroscience by John Sweller. It's called the cognitive load theory. And Sweller said that instruction, when you're teaching, it has to be introduced in such a way that it reduces working memory load. and that thereby facilitates the formation of long-term memory in our synapses. That's a lot to think about, but it is true. And I think that we should think about not just how, if you want to be heard, you also have to be remembered. People have to remember beyond 30 seconds. And I think for a lot of us, that's becoming a problem. So again, everything I'm telling you to do about concision also helps with the formation of long-term memories, helps people, even if they are high-level people, CEOs, principals, New York Times reporters, still, it's hard for people to retain what you've told them. So you need to help them do that. Now, a big question is how long people will read or think or listen before they interrupt themselves. Now, Zoom, I interrupt myself constantly. I'm being interrupted by Slack messages and emails and cell phones and tweets, and I think everybody is kind of going nuts. The elite reader, in studies that I have read, this is the 1%, and I think that you're going for the 1%. They can read 650 words a minute. The average high-level executive reads 575 words per minute. And the average college student reads under 450 words a minute. The data vary, and of course, we don't know how long people can read now because they get interrupted or they interrupt themselves by looking at their phones. And we're all experiencing hypermind, where we're sort of hopping from one thing to another, like these kind of crazy hyperlinks. So we don't really know how bad it is. I submit without evidence that it's worse. It's gotten worse during the pandemic, so we have to just do more. But one indicator that I find interesting of what we're up against is that Axios.com, which is becoming more and more popular, their stories run about 75 words long. So that means your average college student is only going to read this for 6 seconds before they decide whether to click or not. 6 seconds. A good soundbite, for those of you who are preparing for broadcast interviews, a good soundbite is less than 15 seconds. On Twitter, a Twitter ad cannot exceed 12 seconds because that's now considered the de facto attention span. So when the average person speaks at about 130 words a minute, you should time yourself. If you're doing broadcast, you really want to figure out how many words are 15 seconds, and you must time yourself. Get your iPhone out. It has this wonderful timer. People don't use this timer. Say everything you want to say and time yourself. Break it into sound bites and figure out how long that sound bite is. And remember that the other person is taking notes. If you don't want to be misquoted, you have to allow the person time to write things down. How are you going to do this? Well, first of all, you got to distill your message. And all of you have incredible expertise about trade. You have amazing command of the details. You have to try to somehow convey this stuff to people. It's important. They're asking you questions. You need to answer them. At the same time, though, you've got to distill your message. Can I have the next slide, please? So distillation. When I talked to experts at my old employer, the Rand Corporation, and I would tell them I wanted to distill things, they would say, yeah, I don't want to be dumbed down. I'm going to look bad in front of my fellow experts and if I'm dumbed down, and they like the jargon. And I would say to them, could I have the next slide, please? Distillation is not equal to dumbing down. It is something very different. Dumbing down is what you do when you distort or you omit critical facts or nuance. But distillation, could I have the next slide, please? Distillation is what you do when you make a fine perfume, or if any of you are brandy drinkers, it's what you do when you make brandy. You boil down your ingredients into this blend of their most essential elements. And in doing so, you create something that is of greater value than what you started with. Think about this perfume and its value per ounce. Why? Because it's the essence of everything just distilled into this tiny amount of fluid. So good distillation is not crude. It retains subtlety. And that's what makes a good aphorism. A good aphorism, of course, is very subtle. So when I say be concise, I don't just mean cut the clutter. What I also mean is distill. Okay, again, easy for me to say, right? How do you actually do this? So first of all, before an interview, as I say before, and I'm going to say it about 3 more times this hour because I want you to remember it. And Hillary Clinton used to say repetition is our friend. So I'm going to repeat this. Before an interview, write out your sound bites. Write them out. Time them. Look at how many words they are and decide what they are. And you can't have more than 5. Max. Usually 3. But write them out and keep repeating them. And then think of them as haiku. Next slide, please. So when I teach this class, which I have taught it for as much as 3 days, a long version of this, I make everybody write haiku. But I submit that you have a lot to do in the pandemic. But if you want to prepare for an interview with a journalist, the first thing you should do is pull out a piece of paper and write a haiku about your message. Why do you do this? What haiku forces you to do is to distill. It forces you to do the work so they don't have to, because you are doing the work, right? And it helps you be quotable. It helps you be heard, but it also helps you be memorable. And you don't have to worry about the syllables. It doesn't have to be exactly, the right number of syllables in Japanese. But if you look at some haiku, you will see what I'm talking about. Could I have the next slide, please? This is an example of there's a genre called saiku, which is scientific haiku. And it's scientists who are practicing to be better communicators of their very complicated scientific messages. And this is one of my favorites. This was done by a scientist who worked on the IPCC committee, the International Panel on Climate Change. And they came up with something like 368 recommendations. They had very complicated scientific messages. And they realized that nobody was listening to them on global warming because, among other things, it was complicated, but also things seemed so contradictory and complex and nuanced. And it just wasn't getting through. It was not being heard. Anyway, he got the flu. And he was a haiku fan. He had a bunch of haiku. And while he had the flu, he was lying in bed and he couldn't really think very well. So he decided to just write some haiku about his findings. And this is one of them. And note that this message actually is incredibly subtle, because the message here is, even if we stop emitting tomorrow, the oceans will continue to warm. Therefore, climate change will continue to advance unless we actually do something more than what we think we need to do. We need to almost overshoot in order to bring things down. That is a message that is still not heard very much. People understand that the oceans are warming. What they don't understand is that even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, the seas will continue. For millennia, the seas will continue to get warmer. It's a very powerful message. He did it in how many words? 12 words. Okay. It took him, it's hard. It's very hard, but it's worth it. That's my advice to you. I'm happy to take questions and try to help you with specifics. I also, before I take the questions, I want to put in a pitch. Many of you are people that I would love to invite to come and brief our reporters. We're starting, as Andrea mentioned, we're starting January 26th with a new series of 10 webinars on international trade. We hope to reach reporters both in Asia and in the United States. Europe is maybe. We'll be doing some of them at late at night and early in the morning in order to catch the Asia crowd. If you want to speak and if you're willing to get up early or brief reporters late at night, please send me an email. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and would love to talk to you. And also, I am soliciting ideas of what we should be covering. So what I want to ask you in turn, and we can discuss this, I hope in the Q&A, but is, what is it that reporters are getting wrong? What is it that they don't know that they should know? What is it that they don't understand? What is it that they misquote? When you read an article and you go, God, that story just isn't very good, that's when I want you to write to me and write to Sonni and say, this article is really bad because the reporter doesn't understand X, Y, Z. That is my job. I will teach them, but I need to know what they're getting wrong before I can help them get it right. So that's my ask. And I'll turn over to you for questions.
Oh, thank you, Sonni. And it's really interesting to hear your feedback too about how reporters approach this. And, really, like it or not, there was a massive uptick in trade policy developments over the last 4 years. And it seemed to us that so many people were pulled off of beats or new people introduced to the trade field that, just to cover the daily, unfolding of developments. And so you probably had a lot of people move into this space who had no background previously. That Doug Palmer at Politico has been doing this for years and years and knows as much as any, practitioner, maybe more. And many others started to cover this who didn't have any background. I want to come back around to that, the sort of pulling back a little bit and talking more about the the reporters in the field right now. But first, I have a few questions for you. I'm sure people will have also a million questions. So I'll wait for them to type those out or raise their hand. But in the meanwhile, how do professionals in the field position themselves so that reporters will find them and identify them as experts, and come to them because they view them as a trustworthy and a relevant expert in the field of international trade? So how do those of us in the WIT community make ourselves known to reporters?
Right. Well, breaking in is hard, but it's easier than it used to be. And the reason it's easier than it's used to be is that reporters are living on social media now. And so they can reach people that they didn't even know existed before. So I would say, of course, your LinkedIn and your Twitter feed. I think it's very important. If you are quoted, you absolutely want to put that on Twitter. You want to try to say, here's my quote. But all the advice that I just gave you is absolutely applicable to Twitter, which is, of course, concision. Look at President Trump. He's run an entire administration on Twitter. This is his policy platform, and he's done it all in the 130 characters. Whatever you think about him, he's a genius to do this. It is very difficult. He's a master of concision. But you can put your sound bites on Twitter too. And so when I said write out those sound bites, time them. How long does it take? If you have something to say about trade and you want to be quoted, tweet it and work on your tweets. Don't, I actually, one advice I have given people a lot is do not tweet in Twitter. Don't even tweet in Hootsuite. Start in Microsoft Word, open a document, write the 6 things you want to write. Then you're going to cut the first 5. And then when you end up with exactly the right thing, like my haiku, then cut and paste that and put it in Twitter. Otherwise, you're liable to do a Trump and you'll regret it, right?
Right. Yeah, if everybody would put that much thought into their tweets, that would be great.
But reporters are on Twitter all the time, and they are looking for quotable people. That's what reporters do. They have we all have a built-in homing mechanism that is just drummed into our heads, and we are like, we're like heat-seeking missiles. We go for good quotes. We're built that way.
And what if you're called on the spot? So you talked a lot about, and I think it's really smart advice, if you know that you have an interview coming up, that you're going to do the preparation and write out your quotes and time them and that sort of thing, make sure there's impact there. But what if you're just called on the fly and a reporter calls, says, I have a deadline today, can you respond on the spot here? What should you be thinking to yourself, like right off the bat? Are there questions that you should ask the reporter to kind of ground yourself and understand the context before you engage?
So you should ask a couple questions. So the first thing you should always ask is, oh, great, I'd love to talk to you. What's your deadline? And then you should say, what's your angle? You don't have to tell me anything secret, but what's your angle? And then try to get that out of them, not just the question. Because, and then you can also ask them, you can ask them point blank, if is there news here that I don't know about? Sometimes they're calling you for quotes on a story and they're not telling you the news because it's a secret and they've got a scoop. So sometimes they won't tell you, but they'll tell you enough. And so if you're worried about being quoted out of context, it's kind of helpful to know where the reporter is coming from. So often the reporter's just calling you for a reaction. It's just, the Secretary of Commerce said this, or the USTR said that, or, Steve Mnuchin tweeted this, or whatever it is. And okay, you need a reaction, and the reporter's going to go and they're going to find 3 or 5 or 6 trade experts, and then they're going to take the best quote. And what they're doing is quote collecting. So it can be very quick. But what you can say is, if you aren't ready, you can say, oh, okay, that's great. Hold on just 1 minute. I have to do something at home or whatever on Zoom. I'll call you back in 15 minutes. What's your number? I'll call you back in 15 minutes. Take those 15 minutes. It's very rare that you won't be quoted if you call somebody back in 15 minutes.
Okay.
Those 15 minutes and then spend some time thinking about what you want to say. But actually, if you've tweeted it that morning, then you know what you want to say, and the reporter's calling you because they saw your tweet. And then that's your entree to say, well, repeat it. First of all, repeat it, because they have to hear you say it. Oh, this is something that people don't understand. Back in the day, you had to actually hear someone say something in order to report it. I would not use unless it was a transcript by someone of a congressional hearing. I would not use something someone wrote or something that they put in a press release, because I'm not sure if that press release was written by them. It might be written by somebody else on their staff or whatever. If I didn't hear the person say it, and it annoys the hell out of press secretaries, because, you know, the press secretary says something, but you know what? No, we don't know. And, you know, President Trump is an example of that, because, you know, sometimes he contradicts his own officials, but he is by no means the first. And so it was always a rule, an actual rule, you know, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, that you had to hear things come out of somebody's mouth before you would put them in the paper. And I still think that that's a rule for journalists to live by, but you want to make sure that just because they saw your tweet, or maybe they didn't, you can repeat things. Again, repetition's your friend. Say what you want to say first. Then you're going to explain all the stuff. Then you're going to repeat it. So you might need different versions of this soundbite. Have it in front of you. If there's 6 things you want to say, have it in front of you. Answer their questions, but make sure that you get those sound bites in.
I think it's fascinating, you know, for a lot of us, and I can't speak for, you know, everybody in the community, we're all in different positions and had different experiences along the way. But a lot of us had time in government where you weren't allowed to speak, engage a reporter. I moved to the private sector right after government, and that was even more, well, not more constraining, but pretty much the same, in the sense that you have a communications arm, and corporations are very, right, they funnel everything through those PR people. And so a lot of us, by the time you get into a position where, you know, you may be free to speak to a reporter, haven't had any experience.
And you're terrified of saying the wrong thing. But I will tell you that good sources drive the news. Reporters live by good sources, and it is the people who return reporters' calls, tell them the truth, explain things, and are quotable. They win, and they drive the news, and they are on page 1. And I mean, it is fascinating. And some of them are politicians, but some of them are business people, some of them are experts, but they're the ones that really, you know, influence not just how the story is written, but what goes on page 1, what matters, what goes on the homepage, what gets updated, and what stories are allowed to drop off. All of these are driven by what the reporters are told by folks like you. So I want to tell you, you have way more power than you think, way more influence than you think. To be a good source is to rule the world.
It's really interesting. I feel like, so, okay, what's the difference between, you know, being a source and being quoted? Because, right, you have a decision to make about whether you're willing to speak on background or you're willing to be quoted. I personally feel like I see a lot more men quoted in our field than I see women quoted. Is that
Yeah.
because women have chosen to, you know, they're holding back a little bit? They're a little more
Yeah.
fearful of being
Yeah,
quoted?
I find that in general, I did find in general, women are more fearful. They're more cautious. They pad their quotes with all sorts of caveats. They don't want to go too far. They're very polite. It makes them much less quotable. We do it to ourselves. It's
Well, it's
hard.
interesting you say polite too, because I'm wonder about sometimes whether people feel like they've got to be a little more caustic than they normally would be, or controversial, in order to be quoted and to stand out. And if they say something that's sort of, you know, neutral or objective or boring, that they won't make, you know, their quote won't land in the final piece.
That's absolutely true. If you're boring, your quote won't land in the final piece. I'm sorry. I wish it were otherwise. I'd love it to be different, but don't be boring. Don't be boring. It doesn't mean you have to be caustic. It doesn't mean you have to lie, but you can be caustic, but you better be right, and you better be truthful. And sometimes, you know, sometimes that bites people, but oftentimes people are like, hallelujah, somebody finally said it. And the truth is that that's what rises, and that's what people get. Now, I just want to be clear that the definition of a good source, and I hope that all of you will become good sources, because we really, really need smart women driving the underlying narrative. And to do that, you got to be a good source. The good source is somebody who will, you know, kindly correct the reporter's mistakes without making them feel like an idiot, because reporters are doing 1,600 things at once. It's somebody who will call people back, you know, at night, on deadline, whatever. It's somebody who will look up the document for you and tell you where to find the document that you need, because you don't know that it exists. In something like trade, a lot of times, you know, the reporters are, they're subject to fact checkers. They need the evidence. They're afraid of making a mistake as well. So it's really helpful sometimes to say, here's this, and here are 3 documents. And you just give them the links because they need links for their stories. And actually, one of the things we do on our website is we provide resources. And we think that there are things that reporters will need to look at, but also to link to. We want to make sure they have the right document. So that's also part of being a good source, is to say, here's the trade agreement. Here's what it says. Here's what it doesn't say. Here's how it was interpreted in this decision. Here's the decision. And this is, and then you can say your quote, and this is really stupid because, or, this is a nonsensical decision because, or, honestly, the US is losing, to use a polite term, but, we're losing this because, and I wouldn't shy away from using words like that. Plain English is fantastic.
That's great advice. There's a question from Brenda Smith, which was on my mind too, and I've experienced this myself. So Brenda's asking, if you can't speak at a particular time or on a particular topic, for whatever reason, how do you then maintain the relationship with that reporter? So, I mean, I'll give you an example, Sonni. I have turned things down because I was afraid to do them. I went to an event in Canada, spoke at something, and then I was contacted by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Can you speak on air in, an hour at the studio? And I was petrified to do it. And then, of course, I never got called by them again. So if you're not useful on that first contact to them, how do you ensure that you're contacted again, that that they see that was maybe a one-off circumstance and they could come back to you?
Well, one thing I think that's very helpful is if you say, I'm not the right person to speak on this, but you should call so and so, and here's their number. And not like, I'll introduce you to so and so on an email tomorrow, but like, and then you make a call and say, hey, I've got CBC on the line, I can't do it, can you talk to them? Literally, you text your friend and you get your friend to do it. So that's one way, because reporters really, really appreciate that, especially when they're on deadline. Another thing that you can do is say, I can't talk about this, but you should look at these 2 documents. If you happen to know the issue and you can't talk because you're locked down from speaking, you can still refer people to documents, even if you can't talk to them. It's really helpful. Reporters don't know where to find things. Things are hard to find. Giving people links to official documents is not the same as leaking. I want to be really clear about that. Nobody ever got in trouble for pointing a journalist to an official document that is on a government website. And most of the stuff that we're talking about is, and reporters really appreciate that because they're busy. And this is part of what I mean about doing the work for them.
Right. And what about the difference between, speaking to somebody who's writing a print or, an electronic article versus being asked to do broadcast media, which is a completely different ballgame, right? How do you get into that? It's pretty scary for anybody who's never done it. I did a very low stakes. I was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it was by low stakes, I mean, it was a very warm, friendly environment, right? It was a farm journal type thing. And, it was a small room and one person sitting next to the camera. And it was a great way to start. It was a one-off for me, but scary nonetheless. So, I mean, can you go from doing nothing to walking into, a CNN or a Fox News or whatever it is? Like, how do you?
Sure, you can and you should, and there's no good way to. There's no good way to go to the farm leagues. One thing I do tell people, and I'm trying to do this myself, is, so I think part of our role at the National Press Foundation is to train young journalists to become great journalists. And what does that entail? Well, one thing it entails is spending a lot of time with people. I mean, I benefited so much when I was a cub reporter at the Lawrence Eagle Tribune in Massachusetts, and a lot of people just wouldn't talk to you because you weren't at the New York Times. So I'll tell you a story, and I'm allowed to say this now because this person is passed. But somebody who was very nice to me when I was a cub reporter covering politics was Paul Tsongas. Paul Tsongas did a lot of things that were great. He was a good source, right? So first of all, whenever Paul Tsongas couldn't talk to you or wouldn't talk to you, he would say, okay, you can quote me as a source close to Paul Tsongas. I'd say, okay. And then he'd dish, sources close to Songas told you exactly when the bill was going to move and who was against it and this and that. And sources close to Songas said he's threatening to veto it. I mean, he was absolutely using me for, to bluff, but whatever, fine. He was using the press as a negotiating tool. People do that all the time. It was a perfectly happy arrangement. You have to understand that journalists know they're being used for positioning, and that's okay. So you can also, you can talk on background as officials, you can also, but you can't, I wouldn't turn them down. I really wouldn't. I would just prep like crazy, and I would just try to stick to your message. I would try to get somebody to interview you and murder board you and ask you rude questions. And guess what? You're going to mess up because they will ambush you. You're looking at a person here who was on my maiden TV appearance in Boston. I was a reporter for the Lawrence Eagle Tribune. They promised me that they would not ask me who was going to win the New Hampshire primary. They would not ask me to predict because I'm not a pundit, I'm not a pollster, I'm just a journalist, I'm just a reporter. But I had been with all of the 14, presidential candidates, and I predict. Then they lied. They ambushed me at the very last minute. He goes, "Okay, who's going to win the New Hampshire primary?" Boom, 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 and he came to me. I'm last. I can't say it on live TV, so I said Bob Dole. What an idiot. I came back to the newsroom. I'm like, I don't know if Bob Dole's going to win. Of course, George Bush won. I felt like a moron. So no matter what you do, you will have these moments. But trust me, you will survive them.
That's great advice. That's great advice. I know Caitlin had a question. Did you want to pop in, Caitlin?
Thank you so much for all the wonderful tips you've had. I want to ask a question about speaking on background. I get a lot of those requests at my organization, and it's a little bit different than just writing a 15-second soundbite. So I'm curious what kind of tips you have when you do get that request to speak on background.
Right. So first of all, the first thing you should do is find out what they mean by background. There's background and deep background, and different agencies have different organizations have different definitions for what that means. And sometimes people don't know what a reporter is saying. So background means I'll speak to you as a US official, or I'll speak to you as a German trade official, or I'll speak to you as a corporate executive familiar with the process, or who asked not to be named because they have a complaint pending at the WTO, or whatever it is. You have to be very specific. If you want to speak on background, some publications will not take that quote unless you say why you won't give your name. There's huge pressure on reporters to get you to talk on the record, because otherwise, you're accused of fake news and lying and nobody trusts you. So it is the reporter's job to pressure you, arm twist you, browbeat you, and do everything possible to get you to say yes to using your name. Don't take it personally. It's their job. They are under tremendous pressure to do that. So a lot of times what people do is, so first of all, ask them if background means, as a US official. Deep background in my world meant, we'll tell you this and you can use this, but you can't attribute it to me. So you can you can use the record. Off the record is you can't use this information at all unless you can get it from somebody else. But you can use this as a tip. It's like a tip, and you can go try to look at it. When people say off the record, my strategy as a journalist was always to say, well, wait a minute, off the record, let's just put this on deep background, because if you're telling me this, I want to use it, even if I don't use your name. Can you be quoted as this? And I would try to negotiate them up that scale toward, and maybe the second time I talk to them, or the third time I talk to them, I say, hey, listen, you're a font of information, but I can't keep using anonymous sources. You need to come out and talk to me. Can you give me something on the record? What can you say on the record? Go to your boss, find out what you can say on the record. We need something on the record. And, and over time, I would build up trust with them. It also helps if you don't misquote people, or you don't, then eventually they start talking to you. So, there is a relationship of this, but I think that it's important for sources to clarify what the ground rules are. Does that answer your question?
That was perfect. Thank you so much.
Really interesting. So Sonni, back to, the series that you've been running, for a lot of us, and I mean, I think we're curious about what you find trade reporters need right now, right? How can this community be useful to them? What are they looking for? What kind of issues are they covering? And what do you think they need most from from experts in the field.
Right. So I think they need two things, and they're contradictory things. And this is always the challenge. So they need guidance about what are they going to be the big issues. There's a million decisions in this and that, and people kind of know, they know the big themes, but there's a big difference between knowing something and knowing that there's going to be a decision on X at the WTO. If there's something that you're watching and you know that, sometime in January, this decision is likely to come down and everyone's going to have to write a story about, this WTO trade case, right? Good reporters always will ask you, and they should ask you, what's coming down the pike. And if they don't ask you, you can become a good source by telling them, hey, do you know that, by the way, there's really going to be a decision on this, that this is pending in this body or that body, or there's a dispute, or this corporation has filed, it's not Boeing, it's been going on for like 18 years, but like, if you happen to know that the Boeing decision, there's going to be a resolution to Boeing, that's huge news. Often you are in possession of information just about timing of things that is hugely interesting and useful to reporters, even if I know that something's going to come down next week, because I'm not going to be wasting my time calling my sources when I know that there's no chance for a decision. I have to land the story. I want to be first. Being a good source, like if you want to get in with whoever it is, that you want to be a good source, that you want to be called by, one of the things to do is let them know when something's likely to break and likely to be newsworthy. So that's one thing. I'd say the second thing about being a good source, and this is hard because it comes under my category again of do the work for them, which is a huge category, by the way. So a lot of the people who are coming to our trainings, interestingly, are local, state, regional journalists, sometimes for some of them are non-traditional providers because journalists are being fired, news organizations are shutting down. They're freelancers, they're working for university websites, they're working for trade associations, they're publishing stuff, they're bloggers. But some are working for like the farm publications. And we had a lot of people suddenly pouring in from, there's several reporters from Iowa and Nebraska who are now my best friends because they come to all of our stuff. Why? Because they didn't give a hoot about international trade before, but now it's really hot and they don't know a lot and they need help. They know just the farm piece of it very well, and they've got excellent sources there, but they're looking for the context, right? So one strategy is, and again, I'm going back to my days at the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, and sorry, but there's two things. One, the reporters at these farm publications, they end up at the New York Times and the LA Times, and they end up being foreign correspondents, and they remember who talked to them, and they remember who wouldn't give them the time of day. And, you're just more likely to treat someone fairly. Second, if you really want to have impact, I truly believe a lot of these trade stories can only be told on the local level. So if you happen to know something that's going on with a company in a region, or somebody calls you about, just some trade dispute or some issue that you're covering, and if you have any way of telling them how that's going to play out on the local level, it's like, gee, the companies that are going to be most affected by this are, and you name those companies to them and tell them, and you name which states are going to be the most hurt. This is tremendously valuable information for reporters. Often this stuff, you just don't know it's useful. So do think about the local angle and like who's affected. The reporter, whatever you say to that reporter, they're going to have to go find an example of real people in real places that have been hurt. And Andrea, you've done such a wonderful job on tradevistas.org of making this personal and practical and how trade affects people's daily lives. This is the reporter's job. If you do that job for them, they will love you.
I appreciate you saying that. I struggle with that too, though, because so many of us think in the macro, right? We're here in DC, and we're thinking in macro terms, general equilibrium terms, right? And not local and personal. And I'm always impressed with reporters, who are able to find those stories and bring that to life. And yeah, so we'll take that to heart. That can be a very effective way to tell your broader point too, in addition to helping them fill out their story. We do have another interesting question, and I want to, just before I forget, mention that you said that it's useful to reporters to offer them high quality resources, and you do maintain those on your website. So that's one way for those of us who are listening and who will watch this rebroadcast, that if there's something to offer, Sonni, for the National Press Foundation site that's really useful, high quality documentation, for reporters, they do seek it out there. So that's one way to be useful. The question, here's the question in the Q&A box. How do you keep a journalist honest? So the example is, what if they said you wouldn't be quoted, but then you are? How do you handle that? What do you do?
Well, the first thing is you should just call the reporter up. You should call the reporter up and say, hey, you said you wouldn't quote me, but you did. And can we talk? Because, I want to be helpful to you, but you have to not burn me. If you want me to be a good source, I can be a really good, and the way you want to phrase it is, I can be a really good source for you, but you have to take care of me. You have to protect me if you want me to be your source. Every journalist understands that. If they don't, they're out. Second, if you're really burned, you can go to their editor, but if you do that, the reporter will never call you again. So I suggest that you start with a reporter. And I have actually had people call me up yelling at me about something or other who've then become really great sources. Including people who called me and said, you got this wrong. This is wrong. And I'm like, well, what do you mean it's wrong? I don't think it's wrong. Whoa. And they're like, you need to write a correction. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I think this is right. What makes you say it's wrong? Show me. I'm happy to correct the record, but like, what is it? And instead of writing a correction, the person gave me a front page story saying, oh no, by the way, there's all this other stuff that you don't know about, that you didn't find out about, et cetera. So instead of a correction, the person got a front page story by saying, hey, there's more to the story or whatever. And, sometimes this works. I don't recommend yelling at reporters, but I do recommend telling them honestly, hey, this is unfair. Don't do this. And, it works both ways. They have to push you to go on the record, and you have to push them to protect you. And don't be afraid to say that. Say, this is the deal. Or, I went through this actually, because, when I went into the State Department and I, signed all those terrifying documents about not disclosing anything. And then reporter friends of mine would be like, well, why won't you talk to me? Why won't you tell me about this? And I'm like, I really can't talk to you about this now. But if you tell me your angle, I will get someone who can talk to you to call you and say what can be said about this. And that's a big technique also. Like, I can't talk to you, but I'm going to get somebody to call you. Mm-hmm. And what's your deadline? What's your cell phone? And I'll get somebody. And go and get somebody. That people really appreciate that, because they might only have 15 minutes to deadline. They have to put something up.
Yeah, I try to do that, and I've deflected probably more than I should. I think it's interesting I've learned a lot from you and just talking to you about what you consider and what reporters consider newsworthy. Something that we might think it's sort of in the community. It's really interesting to us, but it isn't going to be interesting to the general public. And you've been really helpful in kind of helping me understand the difference between those things. But one frustration I have is sometimes I'll think to myself, well, why is my angle, very interesting or unique? Why would I want to be quoted in that area? Or will my colleagues think, why is Andrea being quoted in that area? She's not the real expert. And yet then they'll go to somebody who gives them a very generic, anybody could have said it. Well, this could go either way, says, male so-and-so at so-and-so think tank. And you're like, well, why didn't I just give that quote?
Well, and part of the reason is this is why I'm really happy to talk to this audience, because the truth is that a lot of the women will say, I've been turned down by so many women, who wouldn't. And by the way, not just, we also have women who don't want to speak to National Press Foundation. They're like, oh, why don't you get my colleague who's more senior and who's inevitably male to brief? And I'm like, no. So we've really made an effort to try to get, younger women and less senior women, and also very senior people. But so again, I would say though, don't give them a dumb quote. Give them a great quote. Do the work. Give them a fantastic quote. The best thing that you have is you guys are really smart. You know what's going on. And I absolutely know that when you really know your stuff, you can be very, very clever. So don't be afraid to be clever. Be quotable, be concise, be eloquent, and they will come back for more. Believe me, trust me, because every day, a reporter needs 5 good quotes. Yeah. Any good reporter needs 5 good quotes a day. I mean, reporters live for this stuff. This is it's in their DNA to go around collecting the best possible quotes. So don't say, oh, please, I can't talk about this. Really try to find some way. And maybe it's just going to the person in your agency, or it's going to, you call your communications person and you say, hey, the reporter's saying this. Can I say this? Can I say that? What can I say? People used to come to me all the time and say, oh, what can I say? And you can find a way to say what you want to say in a clever way and get the communications person to let you say it. And then you say what they agree to. Don't push them back on the PR team. If they'll let you talk, and just have the communications person make sure that you're, within your bounds, but don't punt that over to some, anonymous spokesperson. No one wants to quote a spokesperson. Believe me, we do not like quoting spokespeople.
Yeah.
Spokespeople hate that, but we want to quote people in agencies who are actually working on the thing. And even if it's as an official working on the brief, reporters really value being able to talk to the person, not the spokesperson.
Well, this is so valuable, Sonni, and inspiring. So distillation, haiku, be quotable, be clever. We're going to do all those things. I want to say we record these things for professional development. We offer it behind the member, on the member portion of the site. We will promote it so that people can watch it later. And I think everything you've offered here in terms of advice is evergreen, and it's always good to distill, of course, always good to be concise, no matter what you're doing, whether you're talking to reporters or executives or principals within the government. So very valuable advice. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's been so great to get to know you over the last year. I look forward to working with you on your next series, and I hope that the WIT community can be a resource for you as you put that together. And thank you.
Thank you so much. And
Thanks.
please be in touch. I'd love to see you all on our programs soon.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.